Hello and welcome to the European Dialogue, a podcast brought to you by the EU Values Jean Monnet Network, where we examine the most pressing global issues with leading experts to explore the forces shaping our world today. I'm Emily Jones, and in this episode, we have a very special guest joining us, a scholar whose work has been instrumental in understanding international relations, European integration, and Turkey's evolving role on the global stage. I was honoured to meet with and learn from Professor Meltem Müftüler-Baç. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabancı University in Istanbul, and with an academic career spanning decades, she has contributed extensively to the study of Turkey-EU relations, foreign policy, and global governance. In this episode, we will hear about her recent publication titled A Fragile Relationship, Turkey and the European Union Moving Beyond Membership with External Differentiated Integration. So stay tuned to hear from one of the experts in the field on EU-Turkey relations. Meltem, welcome to the podcast. To kick things off, could you share a little bit about your journey for our listeners? With such an impressive background, we would love to hear about your work with the EU Values Network and your involvement in any other kind of key initiatives shaping European and international relations.
Thank you, dear listeners, participants. It's great to be here in this EU Values podcast. For those of you who are already familiar with the podcast, let me still remind you that we have this Jean Monnet network that is composed of multiple partners all across the world. It's coordinated by the EBE in Barcelona, and it basically looks into the European values and the way that it has become instrumental in making the European Union more visible in global politics. I'm one of the consortium members, and my own area of expertise is the European integration process, the EU's external relations, and specifically Turkey's relations with the European Union. I've been working on this topic for more than 30 years now. I received my PhD in 1992 from Temple University, USA. This is when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, when the newly emerging European Union with the integration of the East and West was underway, when the new policies such as the CFSP, the immigration policy, everything was being drafted together. So I personally witnessed from 1992 to 2024 now the evolution of the European Union as a process of unification, but also the very process of Turkey's relations with the European Union, which went through major ups and downs over the past 6 decades. And I'll be presenting now one of the most recent papers that I have on the subject on external differentiated integration, and that has been published in the Western European Politics as part of a special issue, where my colleagues from EUI and from the Free University Berlin and Rente they have compiled a special issue to look into the way that the European Union's external relations with non-member European countries such as Turkey, Norway, Ukraine, the Western Balkan countries, and even the United Kingdom now are taking shape. So I'll, try to answer all of your questions in that realm, but also beyond the paper as well.
So nice to hear about the various initiatives you are part of and your background as well. Now let's look at your research on EU-Turkish relations. Can you start by telling us why Turkey's relationship with the EU is so complicated?
That's actually a very good question. But in order to answer that question, I really have to take you a little bit back in history. Now, when the Turkish Republic was established in 1923 out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, one of the main foreign policy principles of the founders of the Turkish Republic is to gain acceptance for Turkey as a European state. And while Turkey remained neutral during World War II, at the end of World War II in 1945, the newly emerging European and international institutions had a very specific role in space for Turkey. Turkey became among the founding members of the European institutions at the time. When the predecessor of the OECD was established in 1948 for the management of the Marshall Plan, Turkey was again one of the countries involved directly from the very beginning. In 1949, when the Council of Europe was newly established, Turkey, together with Greece, became part of the Council of Europe, and it was one of the original signatories of the European Convention of Human Rights. In both of these institutional frameworks, Central Eastern European countries were, of course, not in, but neither was Spain, neither was Portugal. And of course, West Germany at the time had significant trouble as well. In 1949, when NATO was created as a bulwark or as a major protective mechanism against Soviet expansionism, Turkey wanted to be in from the very beginning, and they became, together with Greece, members of NATO in 1952. So these three main memberships created the institutional basis for Turkish inclusion into the European architecture at the time. And when the Rome Treaty was signed in 1957, which established the European Economic Community, Turkey was aware that there was something that is a little bit different than the other institutions. It was, signed by 6 countries, but it was a European institution. It was an ongoing integration project, and Turkey applied together again with Greece, and Greece is an important factor to take into account here, to become members of the European Economic Community at the time in 1959. Now, this sets the tone for the rest of the paper and in other scholarly articles as well. When Greece and Turkey applied to become members of the European Economic Community, the European Commission did not immediately reject these applications, just the opposite. The Rome Treaty had an explicit rule that stated any European country which is a democracy and has a market economy could apply to become a member of the European Economic Community. So for both Greece and Turkey, the European Commission said, okay, we have a situation here. Are these European countries? The answer is yes, it's affirmative. They are both part of Europe. Are they democracies? This is 1959. Yes, the answer, they have free and fair elections. They seem to have a multi-party system. But are they free market economies? That's where the trouble began. They were not completely free market economies. So instead, the European Commission adopted a novel formula, established an associate membership, and signed the Athens Treaty with Greece in 1962 and the Ankara Treaty in 1963. Now, this is a critical point in history for Turkey-EU relations, because the Ankara Treaty states explicitly that Turkey is on the road for membership. How? Article 28 of the Rome Treaty says when both parties, i.e. the European Community and Turkey, are ready to fulfill the obligations arising from membership, it will become it will accede to the European Economic Community. Now, of course, keep in mind, we are looking at 1963. Fast forward 6 decades, today, in a head of state, let's say like Macron or Merkel in Germany in 10 years ago, none of them could actually say, okay, Turkey is not eligible for membership. Turkey's eligibility is based on the Ankara Treaty, but then it had to fulfill all the obligations. Turkey revolved at a pace of its own, but it's only after the end of the Cold War, when its role as a protector against the Soviet Union, its basis for being part of Europe no longer was there. That's when we actually see increased question marks. So when the European Union was formed in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht, it prioritized unification of Europe with the Central Eastern European countries, and Turkey found itself kicked outside of the line, but its legal eligibility remained on the ground. Now, think of yourself on the shoes of the European Union, let's say. The European Union in 1992 was faced with a set of applications coming from Central Eastern Europe, from South Europe, like Turkey, like Malta, like Cyprus. So in 1993, for managing the enlargement process as well, and to understand who is eligible, who is ready, the European Union adopted the Copenhagen criteria, which operationalized the Rome Treaty's Article 237 further, saying that any applicant country should have a level of democracy and level of political preparedness, democratic stability, rule of law, protection of human rights, all of that kind as a package, so that it could become what is called a candidate country. So the last 30 years have evolved through Turkish desire to meet as much as possible the EU rules, and a change in European governments which looked favorably at one point, unfavorably at another point. That also had a direct impact on the European Union's credibility of the accession process in the Turkish eyes, and therefore the democratic reform process has slowed down. Now, in the last couple of decades, after the membership of Cyprus in 2004 to the European Union as a full member, all the problems that are in the region that involves Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus are directly transferred to the European Union. So today, any kind of a progress is no longer possible precisely because we have vetoes coming from Cyprus, we have vetoes coming from the European Commission, and these also multilateral and bilateral vetoes, which brings a stalemate in the accession process. And that stalemate have made scholars like me look into other venues. Is there another possibility that goes beyond membership?
Yes, indeed. The history there is so important to understand why this relationship is so complicated. I think we could call it really unique. And actually, as you refer to it in your research, the relationship can be described as external differentiated integration. Could you explain for our listeners what this approach or model means and how well you think it aligns with European values like democracy and the rule of law?
That's actually another very good question. Now, let me actually start with external differentiation. In 1996, Alexander Stubb published a very important paper looking at how the European integration process is now evolving through different layers. And the fact that, in 1996, you're looking at with Swedish, Finnish, and Austrian memberships, 15 countries who were members at the time, but not all of them were ready to fulfill all aspects of a membership or all obligations arising from every aspect of the European acquis. So the idea that the European Union could be seen as a variable geometry, as one of concentric circles, is already decades old. But the idea of differentiation is something that applies internally to the European Union. So we have, on the one hand, a set of countries who adopt the euro, another group of countries who go ahead with the Schengen regime, another one with the social charter. Of course, this is not like a pie that you can just pick and choose anything you want from a menu of delights. But nonetheless, there is a legal and formal framework to do that. And the permanent delegations that certain member states have from certain policies, and at the same time, the ability of some of the member states to go ahead with other types of policies allowed the room, or created the room to have another type of relations with non-member European countries who either were not ready or did not want to become members. So a precise point is countries like Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein. They traded significantly with the European Union, but they didn't want to become members. So the European Economic Area Agreement in 1994 allowed them, at least for Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, to develop a very special relationship and their integration into the internal market, which my colleagues like Erik Eriksen at the University of Oslo in Arena identify as a very asymmetrical, hierarchical relationship where the European Union is the rule maker and countries like Norway are the rule takers. They are unable to, make the rules within which their external trade will take place, but that's a price that they pay to become part of the internal market, and then they protect their sovereignty on other related issues because they are not bound by the same set of rules. So external differentiation became a de facto reality by non-member states, and Turkey found itself to be one of them. Now, a very important point for the Turkish external differentiation with the European Union actually could be linked back to the 1995 Customs Union Agreement, where Turkey would have a customs union for industrial products with the European Union, which will enable it to reduce its tariffs on industrial products and then have free access to the European market. And it will also adopt the common external tariff of the European Union without being a member. Now, from 1996 onwards, when the Customs Union Agreement became operational, we actually see an expansion of Turkish-European Union trade to the extent to which It's now Turkey's first trade partner. In terms of trade integration, in terms of economic integration in agricultural products, Turkey has a very specific relationship, which the Customs Union Agreement has also reinforced, and it forms the formal basis of the external differentiated integration. But the European Union's agreements, the European Union treaties, all take into account in all of its external relations adherence to European rules, European values, a stability of democratic system in order for these external relations to flourish as well. So a pressing question is external differentiation or is external differentiated integration in the Turkish case possible without adherence or without an alignment to the European democratic values or not? Now, the interesting answer is it seems to be so. On the one hand, you have economic integration in this level. On the other hand, you have in certain policy areas. I could think about migration. I could think about security. I could think about research. Part of the reason why we are now talking together here, the European program that allows us to work as a part of the same consortium with you is directly linked to the 1999 Helsinki decision, which made Turkey a candidate country and opened all the European Union research and education programs to Turkey. Education is an area where Turkey is fully integrated in alignment with the European rules. So there are multiple areas where Turkey adopts the European Union criteria, fully aligns itself with the European rules so that its functional cooperation flourishes, it expands into different areas as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to consider the various selective relationships the EU has with its member states, and then, of course, non-EU member states as well, as you've just highlighted there. There clearly isn't one straightforward formula for countries to have access to, like, for example, the EU single market. And well, sticking on that point for a moment, let's consider Turkey's trade access to the European market. In your research, you examine how the EU attempts to bring about political reform in Turkey through this access. Could you tell us a little bit more about that approach and how Turkey has responded to it?
Okay, so market access and political conditionality are tied in the European integration literature. If you are, as a third country, want to have access into the European market, there are European political values which you need to adopt. So, and the market access has created a significant level of economic interdependence with the EU and Turkey over the past 30 years. However, the European Union's ability, and this is very important for a scholar like me, the European Union's ability to facilitate or to promote reforms in a third country. It doesn't have to be Turkey. You can look at Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Poland, Hungary, which are already in, is limited. So when the EU wants to bring about political change, it has a tool at its disposal, which is opening its market to the third country. In return for this opening, it asks for political reforms. But anything that is external, you cannot bring political change into a third country or in another country through carrots or through sticks. It's limited. And even without the Turkish example, I think it would be best to look into Poland and Hungary, who went through a significant reform process all throughout the 1990s. And they became full members of the European Union in 2004. Nonetheless, we see a significant democratic backsliding, now less so in Poland because there is a change, a significant democratic backsliding in these countries. But the EU's ability to sanction them for that kind of democratic backsliding is limited, because anything that the European Commission or a European institution would recommend has to be adopted by unanimity in the European Council, and these are, blocked. So the EU, I think, is on a learning curve. It already has learned significantly with the Big Bang enlargement of what it can do politically and democratically in another country and what it cannot do. So it's just an actor that promises certain rewards in return for certain changes, but it's up to, everything that changes in a country is has to take place internally with the internal transformation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it's something we've explored in a couple of recent podcast episodes to note for our listeners as well. The first is with Marja Lisa Ordberg, and we discussed the EU's influence, or as you just noted, Meltem, its limited influence on third countries. And our last, or our most recent episode as well with Veronica Angels looked at the dynamics since the Big Bang enlargement in 2004 and kind of what we've learned building and sustaining democracy since then. So definitely worth a listen to those two episodes. So regardless of, let's say, this tension that you've hinted at there between the EU's wishes for certain political reforms and Turkey's actual political reality, the Turkish economy is deeply connected to the EU. Could the strong trade and business ties alone sustain this relationship going forward, do you think? Or like, do we need a shift in political alignment? Like, what do you think in terms of that?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer, not because of the Turkish internal or political change, but it's a very hard question to answer because of the way that our world is now going through a significant transformation. So it remains to be seen, what is going to happen to democracy. It remains to be seen what is going to happen to the international liberal order that a lot of, our ancestors have created after World War II with these institutions, with the emphasis on rule of law, human rights, the free world, free trade. So all of them are now going under a significant challenge, not because the champions of this world order are declining, but because there are alternative models as well. So China needs a specific mention here. China provides an alternative model of economic development, trade integration to countries in Africa, let's say, that don't have to come together with political strengths or political strings and political conditionalities. So to have this expectation that in transition to a market economy would go hand in hand together with a liberal democracy is no longer that much tenable in today's world. So you can have very strong trade relations. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of these trading countries will become liberal democracies. We are no longer there.
Right. So in the future, we might be seeing more of this decoupling of trade and democracy if the carrot and stick method, let's say, is not working, or indeed if there are alternative options, as you just mentioned. So yes, indeed, very interesting. And so in comparison to other non-EU European countries, for example, you mentioned Norway or Switzerland earlier, how does Turkey's relationship with the EU differ?
Okay. Let's assume this. Let's assume Norway tomorrow morning, the Norwegian government wakes up and says, we want to become members of the European Union. They could become members of the European Union in a matter of months. They already negotiated twice in mid-70s and mid-1990s, and they can do the negotiation very quickly. But in the Norwegian case, there is still a roadblock, very similar to Switzerland. It brings questions of sovereignty. To what extent Norway or Switzerland, beyond the democratic and the rule of law question, to what extent do they want to transfer their competencies to a supranational authority? They don't need any European anchor to become democracies at all, because while the European Union was a very good model for a democratic system, let's say in the mid-90s, early 2000s, it's no longer a credible democratic model anymore. So its ability to lose states into its orbit, promising a transformation in rule of law, democracy, no longer is that much credible, nor is it its main allure. Now, look into especially a country like the United Kingdom. Now, the British exit. In the last 9 years, all the catastrophic predictions of European scholars or very pro-European Union people in the UK did not exactly hold true. I'm not saying that they, I'm not making any judgments on that final decision, but Britain is outside of the European Union, and Britain for Turkey was a very important country as a member of the European Union, because Britain was a champion of Turkish integration, especially under Tony Blair, and when he was empowered in the late 1990s. So with Britain out and its ability to establish different types of trade ties, with Norway and Switzerland, non-EU countries that are also doing fine, but they're of course integrated into the European market with the EEA, which is very different than Britain or Turkey. The European Union is no longer the main economic magnet that you need access to with membership. But if you ask me, as a Turkish citizen, whether I want EU membership or not, I was very pro for EU membership in the previous years. But in the last couple of years, what is happening inside the EU, I already gave you the example of some countries in Central Eastern Europe, but also the rise of right-wing movements that are happening in the EU is alarming for me. So, it is also a question mark as to what is going to happen to the EU in the next decade or so. But to have Turkey as a part of the European economic market, dealing and cooperating with the EU on industrial policy, on services, in industrial products, there is a common interest that is central and essential for both parties, and that's non-negotiable. And I think Turkey is part of the European order, with or without membership, and the European Union needs to have very strong bonds with Turkey, especially in this highly uncertain, turbulent world.
Yes, interesting reference there to Brexit, and indeed with this major change for the EU among other significant geopolitical changes happening right now, it does beg a question of what the EU would look like in the next decade and what it needs to do to continue to be attractive to candidate countries. In your opinion, what do you think are the biggest obstacles, if we could describe it that way, that are preventing Turkey or holding Turkey back from fully embracing EU standards?
One of the things to look into is the national programs in Turkey. Turkey has adopted so many legal changes to align to the European acquis. But if you look into the last couple of years as well, we changed laws on electricity, we changed rules on industrial policy, we changed so many, we adopted so many EU regulations and rules that actually the level of alignment in certain sectors, and this is not a Turkish government or me saying, but the European Commission is saying, in certain specific sectors, Turkish alignment is 99%. So if it becomes a member tomorrow, let's say again, something drastic happens and an accession treaty is signed, in terms of major areas of functional cooperation, Turkey will not have a significant transition period, much shorter and much less than the Central Eastern Europeans who became members in the past. But Turkey is a large country. So if you think of it beyond all the other political obstacles that we talked about, integrating Turkey into the EU's institutional structures, it's not going to be easy. Its population size is so significant that it would become one of the highest, holders of the votes. One of the highest parliamentarian seats would be Turkish parliamentarians. The institutional rules of the European Union need to be redesigned in order to allow for a country like Turkey to be integrated in the same manner. But that was a concern 20 years ago. With or without membership, the external differentiated integration model provides Turkey and the EU to cooperate on so many levels of mutual interest, common policies, from trade to education to research to electricity to energy to migration, and these are all underlined in Joseph Borrell's report in 2023 as well. It is of their common interests to further this even deeper. Now we are talking about the European strategic autonomy. We're talking about global gateway Europe. We are talking about how Team Europe and European presence in different countries, like in different regions like Africa, could be projected. In all of these areas, Turkey's participation and cooperation with the EU would be essential to increase the EU's global role as well. But final point, these all depend on the political will of the nation state leaders. Do we have political leaders in the EU who see what I am saying and who would then be committed to overcome some of the domestic political opposition at home, and forget the need to be, responding to the domestic audiences, and expand relations with Turkey and cooperation with Turkey, because it would be beneficial for all. I think that all depends on there.
Right, yes. I think we are often thinking about why a country hasn't made its reforms yet, or what it needs to do to reform to join the EU. So thank you for bringing a third country perspective to this conversation and reminding us that the internal EU member states also need to be taking action, right? So currently Turkey's EU membership talks, I understand, are frozen. Do you think this idea of external differentiated integration, is this a viable long-term solution? Does it put Turkey in a weaker position compared to EU countries? I think you've touched a fair bit on this in the interview already, but like considering whether the EU, I don't know, should be stricter in some way in holding Turkey accountable, or maybe it could be more flexible in its approach when trying to create and maintain cooperation.
Okay, I have a very quick answer to both of them. Accession negotiations are, well, they are de facto frozen. So it's not actually, completely frozen. Talks continue. But the thing is, it would be better to advance at least some of the negotiations in certain chapters, okay? The ones that come to my mind is it might be mutually beneficial for all of them to launch, further talks about trade and revitalize and renegotiate the customs union agreement. So with or without membership, the current customs union agreement falls short of the existing EU trade agreements, or, last generation of economic integration agreements. So that's something that's essential, that needs to be discussed, negotiated, and relaunched. Energy, electricity, migration, these are all areas where talks could be renewed and renegotiated. For another point that is very important, especially from a Turkish point of view, is the visas. Now, a lot of Turkish people are in need of visas to come to, European countries, EU members, to go and, have a semester there as a student, to do tourism, to do business relations. A lot of my students here are unable to get appointments from Schengen consulates in Turkey to get visas. The visa issue has been a very important thorn for Turkey-EU relations, and it leads to a significant economic loss for the EU. As I said, the European Union has already launched another enlargement process for both the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and lesser Georgia. But when you look into the Commission reports, the new documents, there is no mention of Turkey. So it's as if Turkey is not an official candidate, but Turkey has been an official candidate since 1999, and negotiations began in 2005, and it is still on paper. I mean, de facto, it might have been frozen, but still is on paper an official candidate. So a more, a different type of a clarity is needed there. So I don't think enlargement is going to be possible for a number of countries in the EU anyway in the near future. So it's a very good idea to talk about, as you, pointed out in your question, and as, I have in the paper as well. It would be a very good idea to identify these specific policy areas, look into what could be done to re-energize the relations there, and that would be for the mutual interest for both Turkey and the EU. External differentiated model does not look like a second type of an alternative. So it looks like a viable possibility to keep anchored Turkey to the EU and to have a mutually beneficial relationship for both, not only for the EU, but for Turkey as well.
Well, you heard it here. Let's discuss how we can re-energize, I love this word, external policies in Europe, and make sure that external differentiated integration can be, as Meltem has suggested, mutually beneficial and a viable option for all parties. Thank you so much for your time today, Meltem. It's been so wonderful to learn from you, to hear from you. And yes, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm delighted that you were able, we were able to have this talk, and thanks for inviting me. And we will have more discussions within the, framework of the EU Values project in the years to come as well. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in today to this lovely podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a comment somewhere. We're on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and you can listen to this through our website as well. So until next time, take care, stay informed, and tune in soon.